Good morning. It's 10 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time, and I'm here with Eric Ferraiuolo and Ryan Grove across the table from me here. We're actually in Sunnyvale this week at the mothership, and that makes this a rare open hours where we're hanging out with each other in the same physical place. But um, to get things started, let's talk about the schedule as we know it for 3.6, or in this case 3.5.1, which is going to be a small patch release to 3.5.0. That we're going to talk about the release schedule for this just today, actually, incidentally, right after this open hours. The YUI team is going to talk about when we're going to be pushing 3.5.1. Likely to be in the next week or two. We have most of the little patches that we need to put in for 3.5.1 already in. There's a branch that's up on GitHub for the 3.5.1 master, as it were. And we'll be pushing that up very soon. And what are the high point bug fixes for 3.5.1? There's some, well,
There, I had a panel mask regression where in good browsers it was doing something wrong, and that's fixed. I think there's just a lot of little things that maybe weren't caught by the PRs, but once people started upgrading to 3.5.0, they were reporting in some issues, and so there's a good number of things fixed there.
Is this
some router bugs that we got fixes from that cabinet.
Yeah,
okay.
So pull requests were merged in from Pat.
Are these pull requests fixing bugs, or they're not adding features? Okay, so
fixing bugs. Yeah.
No new features, just fixing bugs. All right.
And so, also, there's a bug fixing get that affected certain versions of WebKit loading CSS.
What was the issue?
So the issue was there was a bad version detection actually in get. So it was incorrectly detecting a very small range of WebKit versions as supporting CSS load events when they actually didn't support it. So you would go to load some CSS and it would just hang. It's waiting for an event that's never going to fire. So that's fixed in 3.5.1. It shouldn't actually be a big issue because those versions of WebKit aren't widely used. So even in 3.5 it should be okay, but we fixed that.
It's really an edge case. It's good. All the same, 3.5.1 is small. It's what you would expect from a patch release, just as little fixes like that. And you can keep your eye out on the blog for the release of 3.5.1, and we'll obviously be tweeting about that as well. So keep an eye out there for it. But so let's see. Was there any other news of the day? All right. So then let's get on to the meat of the thing, which is that Eric has been doing an experiment with the idea. Yeah, photos in your memory, but the idea is that we have code that there's this dream of writing code and being able to share client code on the server and using Node, and so getting the code reuse for being consistent with APIs and that sort of thing. So he endeavored to start this project for doing what? Like an example, creating a tutorial or?
Yeah, well, so I guess some backstory. The Photos Near Me app was used to help dog food the app framework components while Ryan and I were working on them. And it started off as just being all client-side, so the entire application ran client-side. The server was sort of a dumb server that just gave it the HTML and linked to the appropriate JavaScript files, and then would let the browser and the client-side take over and actually run the entire application, grab the data, render the pages, and that sort of thing. And it was really good to help us figure out maybe different issues or different approaches for how we wanted to use the app framework, and served as an example of implementing an app using the app framework. And also it helped drive the development of Y.app, because we were seeing how
Common boilerplate stuff?
Yeah, the common boilerplate stuff with navigation and managing multiple views, and that's sort of where Y.app grew out of.
But the Photos Numeric came out before 3.4, right? Because you were developing it as you were developing the app framework components, and so it was the initial implementation to proof of concept, the specifics of how you wanted model done and how you wanted views done, how you wanted router done. And then as those pieces were coming into the core or into the master branch, I guess, we were getting community feedback on that to then sort of refine those ideas and validate those ideas along the way, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then as the components were changing from 3.4.0 to 3.4.1, and then during the development of 3.5.0, I was constantly updating Photos Near Me to keep up with the latest changes and latest approaches, and a lot of times able to just remove large amounts of boilerplate code, or make things easier by using Handlebars instead of loading in a third-party Handlebars library, and having it be a first-class module made some things much easier to do.
So I guess there's not a whole lot that I need to be showing, because it's mostly you that's going to be showing stuff. So what we want to do in this case here is, in this open hours, is we're going to be doing a code review of that experiment that Eric did for, that's not what I wanted. The experiment for moving some of that logic over to the server side. Now, I think before we get started, for those folks that aren't familiar with Photos Near Me, why don't you give, I'm not sharing, are you sharing them?
I think I am.
Okay, good. Why don't you give a quick intro to just what the interface is, what the app is, and how it works. And noting like what has always worked this way and if the behaviors are changing for the new changes and stuff.
Sure. So let's see, let me go to the root here. And okay, so if I were to go to Photos Near Me, photosnear.me, this little thing comes up and asks, it wants to know, well, I guess wants to track your physical location, which is kind of a crazy statement, but it just wants to know where you are, so I'll allow it. And then, so that's using the geolocation APIs in the browser to figure out where I am, and I'm in Sunnyvale on the Yahoo campus, and so a lot of these photos that will be returned back are tagged with Sunnyvale as being the location. And so, like,
Dave Glass.
Here's an example of a photo of Dave Glass wearing his YUI redneck T-shirt.
What's funny is this is actually sort of a random collection, right? This is coming from Flickr, right?
It's sorted by interestingness, so.
Well, I admit Dave is pretty interesting.
Yeah. So what happened there is, so I'm on this page. I have this URL. It might be hard to see, but it's /places/ some ID number. And I'm seeing this grid of photos. I can keep scrolling, and more will be loaded in. So that type of stuff is happening client side. And then when I click on one of these photos, it's not actually going back to the server. It's super fast. The data is already there in the page on the client. So I'm just swapping out a view to show the details view of a photo, and updating the URL to match. So that way, if this page were to be refreshed, now the request is actually going off to the server and then comes back with the photo that we just saw.
So when you're navigating around, it's just modifying that chunk of HTML in the middle of the page.
Yeah.
But since it's also updating history, and you have like a server-side component to generate markup with this particular picture being the view, right?
Yeah. So before, what would happen is when you would refresh this page, it would actually be the server would handle this request by just redirecting you back to the root of the application using a hash-based URL, which then the y.app instance on the client side would upgrade to a full path URL in good browsers and go out, fetch the data that it needed, and would render the page. So the problem with that is the content wouldn't be indexable by search engines. And also the performance of that is impacted by the fact that one request has to go off to the server to get the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then the JavaScript has to be requested, say for the YUI seed, and then the use statement is going to be requiring other other modules, which then have to go out and make more requests. And eventually the user's just, sitting there waiting for the application to finally load up, all the JavaScript to load, and then the data has to be fetched in separate requests. So it just takes a lot longer, where this, I'm hitting refresh, and it just comes right up. It's instant. And
that was a result of that's the result of the changes that you just made.
Yeah, so the changes that I made recently were to make Photos Near Me have a smarter server, so a server that can actually handle requests that come in instead of just always pushing everything to the client and letting the client handle the request or finish handling the request. So now the server can render the initial state, which makes it much faster. And I was noticing this on my iPhone when I would load up this app and then get a grid of photos, and then if I were to hit refresh, it would be much faster than it used to be, where it had to do the whole process of letting the client grab all the data itself and then render it. So it's basically taking a progressive enhancement approach to this, and
which is a good thing.
Which is a great thing.
Yeah, this is basically a representative of the direction that we want to be able to. That we want to be able to take all of our widget stuff, and so being able to render widgets on the server, push down the HTML, and then just vivify them on the client.
Yep.
So we can promote the progressive enhancement story instead of right now, which we have to a fair extent. We have your interface is being built by JavaScript. For the progressive enhancement story is you are responsible for rendering out the content on the static page, including whatever initial view that might look like one of our widgets, but then the JavaScript needs to slurp it up and then replace that content, just rendering it, replacing it. And in some cases, like tab view, it's vivifying it, but we want to clarify that story more and make it easier to do server-side rendering of stuff like that, and being able to get the code reuse out of there. So this is really the experiment that's dog-fooding the code reuse, right?
Yeah. So also just one other note. So say if you're on an older browser like IE8 or something, and you come and use this application, every time you're clicking on a link or hitting the back button or doing just navigating around, you'll be getting full page reloads. So the server will be handling everything for you. And that allows the URLs at the top to be consistent across all browsers. So if you were to share a URL from Internet Explorer to somebody who's on Chrome, it will all just work, but the person on Chrome will get a more enhanced experience when they're navigating around. It doesn't always have to go back to the server. And yeah, so Jay Shirley's asking if this helps with Google indexing the content, and yeah, that's exactly right. So since the server can provide a response to all the requests at all the URLs that this application responds to, it's going to serve to Google or to any browser or to any HTTP client the initial state for that URL. And so in the case of going to a places page, you'll get like the first 60 photos. And then if you're in a browser, what will happen is the client side takes over from there and then figures out if it needs to keep loading more photos, and it will do it via the client.
Right. So, so what were the initial goals of this specific project that you were going on?
So the initial goals were to try to run YUI in the server, and for me, this was the first time I really gave it a shot. And so I wanted to run YUI in the server so that I could reuse the models that I created for this, like the place and the photo models, and the photos model list, which deals with the grid, and also share the handlebars templates that are used to render out this content. So that way, whether the code's running on, or whether the page is being built on the server or the client, it can reuse the models and templates. And so that was my goal.
So you're not reusing views, you're reusing just the template part of things.
Yep, because on the server, there's really no...
the view also incorporates the events and things like that, which is unnecessary.
Really what I have to do on the server is build up a template, which is effectively just a string of HTML.
Right. So you just, you're more, on the server, you're just concerned with spitting out HTML. So that's sort of like the first stage of rendering out a view, or the first stage of rendering out a widget, is to generate the HTML, and then there's hooking up the events. And so the templates being that first, or the templates being one way to handle that first step of creating the HTML itself. But having all of that HTML live in templates makes it easier to then reuse that in both locations.
Yeah, and since I'm writing in using the same templates and using the same templating language, handlebars or mustache-based templates, I'm not having to change the template for the client side and then change it in some other language or some other templating way to do it on the server. And same with the models. If I change how one of the models works, I don't have to change it in both places. And that way, you're less prone to have bugs. Things are just easier to do. It's faster by being able to share that stuff.
Yeah, there's isolation. You fix it in one place instead of fixing it all over the place.
Yeah.
So Victor, you have a question that says, this is more of a web page style than web application, as there's no real persistent tasks to do. Would it be possible in the future to make it more web application-like? Yeah,
so there's no per user data in this application, and there is no persistence layer where no database backing this. But this same approach could be used if you were building an application where users had to log in and they had per user data. So yeah, this is the photos near me is sort of in the middle between a web application and a website, in the sense that the data is for everyone. Everyone would see the same data, although it's a little bit specific when you just go to photosnear.me, because it will use your current location to show you the photos near you. So it at least has that part of it being dynamic. And also loading in these photos, it's pulling from YQL as the persistence layer. So on the server, it's pulling from YQL, and same with on the client, and it's doing that through the different models that this application uses.
So maybe the point is that as the complexity increases, the initial state of the interface and the various parts of the interface are going to be handled by a larger set of views, and thus a larger set of templates, and then rendering out that initial state and then vivifying from that state starts to get much more complex. And so what sort of patterns would be...
Yeah, I would say if as an application gets more complex, it may be worth even thinking about the different segments of the application as different mini apps. So imagine if you had an application that had like a /users path segment, and there was like a bunch of stuff you could do with users on that page. You may want that to be its own Y.app instance on the client, and like own little mini app, and you may have a /settings route or path in your application, and that may be a different Y.app instance, and that would allow you to keep those things contained and separate, and maybe on different life cycles or development cycles. Like if part of your requirements is to implement new features in like the users portion of your application, you could keep it segmented that way, and it may help. But it is stuff that we're trying to look to see where things fall in terms of like the best patterns and the best way for us to add some infrastructure to help deal with applications as they get bigger and the complexity grows.
Right. So we create the pieces, the building blocks as you work, and then we'll create dog food apps like Photos Near Me, and this is sort of your first stab at starting to solve those bigger problems of reusing code, and then as we get community adoption, we hear about the pain points of creating larger things like the larger systems, and as we work through those issues together, we can document those issues and we can establish best practices, and we can absorb some of those best practices and those patterns into the boilerplate code that result in things like Y.app. But it's tough to say right now what those solutions are going to look like, because we don't actually know what those solutions are going to look like until people are using it and experiencing it, and we can tailor it to what the common problems are as we hear about them, as we learn about them.
And we're also trying to build up where if we just had one example and we threw out this like really complex web application which is using a persistence layer and running YUI in the server and the client, and like just a big app that maybe people would use or pay for or whatever to use, that would be too much for somebody to get started. So like we have the To-Do app, which helps people, which is the most simple app that is actually doing something functional. Then we have the GitHub contributors app, which does a little bit more. Both of those are just client side. And now what we want to do is use Photos Near Me as still simple, so it can be easy for people to get through and understand how it's built. But it's now using YUI on the server and doing things a little more complex, and also working on mobile devices as well as desktops using the same code, trying to share code between the server and client. So then I think it would be nice for us to then go a step further for the next example application that we create and document to have that type of per user data, have that persistence with the server. But that also requires us to host and maintain that application, and also deal with a bunch of people using it and trying to look at it as an example. But I think it's something that would be great to shoot for a level above what we're doing with the other examples.
Yeah, and I mean the folks in the community can help with that too. I mean they can.
Yeah.
The applications that they're creating with it are really helping us figure out how to structure those things. And so if the applications that you guys are creating with this are public or can be public, then we can, depending upon how you feel about it, then you can share your application publicly. We can certainly highlight the application publicly, and work with you pretty closely on the infrastructure of how it's built, so that we can optimize your app and also learn how to what those best practices are for optimizing apps along that scale.
It's kind of funny that I'll say this, but I remember back seeing that in the early days of ASP.NET stuff, when Microsoft would release a new version of ASP.NET, they would package up some pretty advanced applications with it and document how they're working, and just sort of show the approaches that they think you would be successful with using that framework. And so I think that it is something where we would like to keep towards that direction of showing and describing and making these example applications so that people can learn from them, because I think that people get a lot of value out of that. Seeing it helps answer some questions and gets people started, and then gets people thinking about other ways to do things, or how to apply those same concepts in their current application they're developing. So.
It certainly is a documentation challenge.
Yeah.
Right. There's a lot of documentation that needs to come out, and it is such a vague subject matter that there's really so many different ways that you can do things. And the initial philosophy behind the app framework pieces was, here are some things that you can do a lot of things with. You can take these in any direction that it best fits you. And right now it's still pretty loose like that. And that's kind of the idea, is we want to be able to keep it loose like that, but that does make it challenging to document, saying you could do just about anything with this. I mean, here is an example, but it isn't the only example of scaling up something larger. But let's
look at the code.
Yeah, let's look at the code. I mean, we have we'll hear more about this in documentation in a little bit later. So let's see the details.
So all of
zoom up.
Oh yeah. All of this this code is up on GitHub on my fork, or I guess the main fork of Photos Near Me. Let's see, there we go. And let's see, where's the best place to start with this? I guess I can show maybe how I'm dealing with some of the configuration stuff. So I want to, since I'm using similar modules on the client and server, I created this JSON file, which basically represents configuration for the app, like the Flickr API key that I need. But then also I have this like YUI block here, and it can't really be used for YUI configuration, instance configuration as is, but it just helped me create basically 3 module groups. So I have client, and these are modules that are just specific to the client. They deal with this iOS orientation fix thing that I wanted to add, typekit fonts. And then on the server, I'm pulling in a gallery module locally to the local file system here that the server runs off of. So that way it doesn't have to go out to the internet to load this, because I wanted to load YUI on the server synchronously once when the server starts up. So I just defined that module here. And then I have the Photos Near Me group, and this contains all the metadata that the YUI loader needs, and it's shared between both the client and server. So I just wanted to write it once. I figured that the JSON format was a good way to represent this data. So I have that going on there, and then I wrote this config.js file, which loads in the JSON. But then the interesting part here is it creates YUI configuration objects for the server and one for the client. And so it's basically just processing that metadata and doing some things with it. For example, it's setting a path, like a full file system path starting at / for where the actual code exists for the different modules. In this case, the server group and the Photos Near Me group. And then on the client, it's doing other stuff like if the app's running in production mode, then combine the files. If not, don't combine the files. So that way, when I'm just running locally in debug mode, I don't have a big smash of minified JavaScript to debug through. It's nice and separated into individual files and using the raw filter here. So this worked out good, where I could define sort of a static configuration in JSON and then process it in JavaScript in Node. So this is just a Node module. And it's actually requiring YUI here, just the YUI base module on the server. And it's using, I believe, just for the merge function.
Y.merge.
Yeah, so I can merge in the configuration object with some overrides here.
And this is just something that's run at startup, so.
It's just run at startup, yep. And so then how the server's set up is there's just this little dinky server.js. This simply requires the app module. This is the server-side application, which is an Express.js app. And it sets the port, or 3000, basically development mode, and then starts the server, starts listening on that port. So the interesting stuff's actually in this app, app.js. So this is, again, the server-side the server-side app running in Node. So it's requiring that config file, that's the config.js, which has all the process configuration. And it's using Express and also YUI, but we're doing something more interesting here. We're just loading YUI and getting access to the YUI global top-level object. It's creating an Express server. And then...
Do you want to talk about why you're using Express instead of Router?
Yeah, because Router doesn't run on the server.
Okay.
And Express does.
And Express is pretty awesome anyway.
It is, yeah. And it works really well for being able to do routing like we do using y.app or y.router, but then also being able to compose views with like a layout and some templates and providing data to apply to those templates. So it works out really nice. So let's see. One interesting thing I'm doing here is I am doing a use call here. This is loading in Parallel, which is just a utility module we have to do multiple asynchronous tasks at the same time and know when they're all completed. But then it's loading in place, photo, and photos, which are the models and the one model list for photos near me. And so it's loading this on the server, putting it in the server-side YUI instance that's going to be used here. And so this is just set up once, and then this instance will be long-lived for all the requests that come in to the app while it's running. And so this is some configuration stuff that it's doing for the app. One thing that we can get back to is how the view options are set up for handling the views or templates on the server. But let's look at the routes. So the routes here are, this one's very simple. This is just the index page. The problem is with this one is I want the browser to tell me where the user is because we need that information from the user. So this just simply is rendering the index page, which is pulling in a special template, which really doesn't have anything in it but just a loading indicator. And it's saying that the user is not located because we don't know where they are. And we want the browser to figure that out and tell us. I have a combo route here. This is to combine the JavaScript, the JavaScript for the client. So when the client requests the application's custom modules, it'll go through this combo handler to combine them in one HTTP request. And this is using Ryan Grove's combo handler, which is a Node.js based combo handler module that works really well and is intended to work with YUI. So I'm using that here. I added some additional stuff to deal with conditional GET requests, so we don't have to send data if the browser already has it or already requested it. I'm going to skip over this templates resource for now, but then we'll get back to it. So here's an example of a route for the places route, and it has a placeholder here for the ID. So this is now going to actually start using YUI on the server to handle these requests. So I'm creating a new place model object or instance here using the ID that was in the URL. I'm also creating a photos model list, and I'm creating a new parallel instance, which will just help me load, because I need to load the place model. So the load call here is using the model's sync layer, which is actually implemented using YQL. So it's going to load from YQL the data about the place at this particular ID. And this is using where on earth IDs, which is effectively like a nomenclature for describing places using IDs around the world. And And then photos is the model list, and its load method is also being called, which also uses YQL. And I'm giving it the place model, which we have here, which this just needs the ID out of it, so it's fine if the places hasn't been loaded by the time this call happens, which is most likely the case. And what it's doing here is this parallel utility you can call add, and it's saying, add when this returns a callback function, and when that callback function is called, it basically increments something saying that this thing has completed, and I'm doing that here. And then when all the requests are done, that means when both of these load calls have completed, then call this callback here, which uses the response object, which is passed in. This is from an express, like the express route here. It gets response object, so I'm calling response.render place, which is the name of a template, and it's going to apply this data to that template, which is saying that the user is located. The place information that the template needs is the ID and the string. So it would say, for example, Sunnyvale, California. That's the text of the place. And then the photos, I'm just going over the photos and grabbing just the attributes I need here, which are ID, client ID, and thumbnail URL, and that supports being able to generate this grid here. So those are the attributes I need for that. And then I'm doing another thing here, which is I'm taking the data, the raw data that that's held in the place model and the photos model list, and I'm also giving that to the template. And this is kind of an interesting thing. So the reason I'm doing that is I'm just effectively dumping all this data into the HTML of the page. So that way, on the client, when the client y.app instance loads up, it can use that data to initialize itself. So that way, it doesn't have to go refetch that exact same data that the server just fetched. So this is sort of like where things are getting handed off to the client. So it's giving it all the raw data so that the client can take over once the page is loaded.
So that's where you communicate the app state. That's the initial state as far as the JavaScript is concerned.
Yeah,
so you have the rendering in one side, and then you have the data that's needed for the rendering in one side.
Correct.
And then the data that's needed for the JavaScript state in the other.
Yeah, and so this is actually I ran into something here which it seemed like we can figure out a good way to deal with this and make this seamless. And whether all of the data should be rendered into the HTML using data attributes, and then having the client-side application take over by grabbing all the data out of that HTML, or if we should do it more this way, where we're just pumping the raw data out into the page and letting
into a script.
Into a script. Yeah, sorry, into a script block, and then letting the client side use that to initialize itself. So the photos route is similar. It's less complex. It just needs to create a new photo model using the ID for the ID passed in, and then it just calls load on it. Once that load call has finished, it can go ahead and render out the view on the server. So that's like
pretty simple server.
Yeah, it's a pretty simple server. Now I think some of the interesting stuff gets into how all these templates are being cobbled together and where that stuff is coming from.
I think the thing that was understated here, which is really the focus of the experiment, is that you were reusing those same models.
Yeah, like it made it like really easy just to say, new place, new photos, load them both up. When they're done, let me know, and I'll pass that data onto the template.
Right, and then on the client, you're still doing new VNF place, new photos, etc. Yeah,
on the client, it's pretty similar. There's some shortcuts that I can take sometimes, like where if I already have a photos list on the client side of things, populated with the data, I can simply grab the photo model out of the list and use it right then. I don't have to reload it. So there's some shortcuts that can be taken on the client just to optimize performance.
Right.
So if the data is already there, sitting in the client, I don't have to go refetch it. Where on the server, it's dealing with more of this per request lifecycle. So the data has to be fetched to handle each request. Luckily, it ends up being cached pretty good in terms of YQL is responding really fast if you refresh the page multiple times for the same URL.
It has its own server caches which expire after, what, 5 minutes or something?
Something like that, yeah. And so I wanted to show then maybe some more of this structure here. So we looked at server, app, and the config. In public is actually where, in public.js, is where the models live. This is where the code lives for the models. And so this is in public because, mainly because I wanted to support the combo handler to being able to serve it to the client, and also needed it to be in one place so that on the server I could load it from the same location. So it's really just using the same code, which is great because there's like a decent amount of stuff going on in here in these models. So it's really nice to be able to just have this exact same file be used on the server like it was on the client.
And it really is more than just that chunk of code, because that chunk of code is using base.create, which is using base, which is using attribute, and all of that infrastructure, all of the infrastructure code inside of YUI is also being used here. Yeah,
and it's using the like the YQL model sync gallery module.
So there's gallery code also.
And on the client, it's actually using local storage to cache some of this data as well. So it's even faster as you're going around on the client. It can cache it in local storage. So on the server, it doesn't, because there is no local storage object on the server. So that's sitting in public, and then shared here is where I have the handlebars templates that are actually used on both the client and server. So we can look at like the grid here. These are just very simple. It's just creating a list, and for each photo, it's using a partial here to render out each photo using the grid photo template, which we can look at, which is also pretty simple. Just a list item and placeholders for the various data that we need. We need the client ID, the ID, and if there's a thumbnail URL, then print out the image here.
And those are the attributes that you got with getAtters in your photo page.
Yep. So it may be a question of, okay, so we have these templates as .handlebars files, but how are they actually being used on the server? So what I actually did here is I have this templates.js file, which its job is to go through the file system, go through that shared templates folder, and load all of the template data up. And how it loads it is it reads in the files just as strings, and it has access to basically the raw string of that template. And then it sets the raw templates into this raw object with the name. So it uses the file name minus the extension. And then it also creates a precompiled version of this. So it runs through the y.handlebars. So it's using YUI again for this file, and it's using the handlebars module. And it's precompiling the template, which returns a string, but it is a function. So how you would use this is you would take the this precompiled template, and you could inject it into the response that's going to the server.
There's a typo with a semicolon right there.
Which one?
That should be a comma, not a semicolon.
Ah.
Good catch, John.
So I have a global variable, I guess, or something.
Boom.
Well, now that just bugs me. So we have that templates module. So that just helps load up the templates so that they're just available in JavaScript instead of being these files on the file system. And so this Views.js module is used to create this compile function, which is used by Express. So the Express.js app that we have. This is used to fulfill when we were calling response.render. They can use this compile function. And so again, this is using Handlebars on the server. And what this is doing is compiling the template once and then returning a function which then applies the template with the options passed in or the data passed in that we want to render into that template. But what I'm also doing here is, so all of those templates that are shared between the client and server. So here I'm loading in the templates module, which we just looked at, and getting access to the raw templates. So these are just strings. And what I'm doing here is I'm using YUI again to iterate over all the items in this object, this templates object, and registering them as partials. So that way I can just use them by name on the server, and they'll be there and ready for me to apply. So we can go look at now on the server side views folders. Let's see here the place. So this is all that I have for the server to handle the places route. It's creating a div and calling into the grid partial. And so this is being able to just reuse that template that's shared on the server and the client. If we look at the photo one, it's also very simple. It's using the Lightbox shared partial, shared template as a partial. And there's more to it. There's this layout, but this is common for all the pages. This is just the actual HTML page. And then for the places or photos route, those two templates we just looked at their contents are just being injected right here in the middle of this this page here. But yeah, so that's how the templates are working. This is using some more stuff here by being able to create a link to the YUI seed to load that. The YUI config object, which you looked at the beginning, this is setting the server or the client side config object, rendering it out. This is all passing along to the client the API key for Flickr so that this application can communicate with Flickr via YQL. And here what it's doing is we saw some of those responses in the Express routes for applying or giving the data, the initial data or state in raw JavaScript to the client. So that's what's happening here. So let me just go back to show those. So for instance, in the places route, we have this initial data, which we're just dumping out to JSON, the place data and the photos model list data. And so what's happening there is if there's initial data, it'll render out this section on the page, which is just using the top level YUI object namespacing an environment variable called photos near me, and then creating this data object hanging off of that. And that's just, I'm just doing this so I don't create a new global variable. I'm just hanging it off of YUI. And it's applying, if there is place information, dump out all that data, otherwise just put null there. So this is basically just building up JavaScript using templates. And then what happens here is, here's my actual YUI instance, which kicks things off on the client. It's requiring the Photos Near Me app module, which is the app y.app instance or subclass. And that requires all the other modules like the photos model, the place model, and the photos model list, and the views that are used on the client side. But then to seed that initial data, so the server pumps out the initial data above, and then I gain access to it here, which just looks for that that path off of YUI, the namespace off of YUI, and then just creates a new place using that place data, creates a new model list, photos model list, and applies all of that data into it. And then when I create my new Photos Near Me app instance, which is the subclass of y.app, I can give it this initial data here so it can use it, can start off with that data. So that's how this is basically here, this code is basically handing off control from the server to the client.
And this is where it gets into the philosophical debate of whether the server should be rendering out JavaScript or creating JavaScript on the fly, or if you want to, or if the progressive enhancement approach should be or would be better represented by dumping out dumping out more data into the markup and data attributes, and then progressively enhancing from that markup, so that then the rendering process wasn't tied to the responsibility of dumping out JavaScript and dumping out markup. It could, the contract on the server side could just be you render out
Mm-hmm.
HTML and the information about the state is in that HTML.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have to worry about rendering out JavaScript that's going to throw an error and then everything falls over. But it is, in essence, it is sort of a philosophical debate. In a situation like this, where you have pretty well-structured data and it's not terribly complex,
Mm-hmm.
and it can all be represented by JSON, there's a low risk for creating a compile error, a runtime error. But there's an open discussion there. I think there's
yeah, it's like how do we transmit this data to the client that we already have, so the client doesn't have to go refetch the exact same data that's already rendered out there? Can it source that from the HTML by having the server serialize effectively all that data to the HTML, which you want to use like data attributes for a lot of it that isn't actually visually displayed, or do you want to just dump it out to effectively JSON format or raw JavaScript, and then have the client side take over by leveraging that? So in this case, I'm doing the latter there, but
yeah, I think that there's probably room for both of those approaches, and I wonder if there's in the mindset of progressive enhancement, if you're rendering out the initial state of a page from the server, in essence, you want the HTML that you're pushing to the page to work if the JavaScript isn't working. So you're generating links that are pointing back to the server. If the server generates that page, then whether or not your extra data is pushed into data attributes or if it's pushed into JavaScript, then it becomes a moot point. And that's the ideal, right?
Yeah, I think I wonder, there's some way to turn off JavaScript in Chrome, right?
Why on earth would you want to do that?
Well, I haven't actually tested this with JavaScript turned off, but it should just work. Is it?
You have the debug menu.
So let's see.
So we can't see that.
Yeah, you're not sharing Safari.
Oh, okay.
Just figure it out there. There you go.
Okay, so if I refresh this, so it's going to have this loading indicator here, but it definitely loaded the first, I think, 60 photos.
And they're all links.
And they're all links, so if I click on one of these, the server just handled that, and I can go back. And
right, so aside from the loading indicator,
yeah,
you now have the application working with or without JavaScript.
Yeah, and presumably I could do something fancier here with having URLs that represent like /1, /2, /3 to be like a different pages of this data instead of doing the infinite scroll thing. But yeah, it's pretty awesome that this somehow works. Never tried it. It just works.
Which was sort of your experience with a couple of other parts of it, right? I mean, the first time you tried using YUI in the server.
Yeah, I was pretty surprised that my first initial try at creating an instance of one of my models on the server, then loading it, which is going through YQL and hitting Flickr and coming back, just ended up working, and it's like barely any code. I was pretty surprised at how great that worked out. So there's one other piece here that I wanted to show, which was, so okay, we're using those shared templates on the client or on the server, but now how do we get them to the client? And I have basically a dynamic resource for precompiled templates. So on the server here, I created a route for /templates, which you should be able to go to /templates.js. And so this is a YUI module called Photos Near Me Templates, which this is just blasting out the precompiled Handlebars templates here. It requires Handlebars base to operate. So that brings in Handlebars base to the client side.
Right, so instead of requiring Handlebars on the client side,
you don't have to require the full thing because all of the templates are already precompiled on the server. So you can require a smaller, smaller amount, just the runtime. So what's happening here is this is again using this templates module, which this is the thing that loaded in all the templates, and it created two objects, one that held them all raw as raw strings, and then one that held them as precompiled templates strings. And so we're using the precompiled ones here, and then I'm just creating an array of objects with the name and the precompiled template string here. And then what's interesting is so this is actually an enclosure, I should note that, so that I only go through and create this templates array once, so then every request to here just pumps out the data. So I'm rendering a view. This is using Express's view rendering, just like the other routes are. I don't want any layout, so I don't want, and this is not an HTML page, it's a JavaScript resource. So that's why I'm setting application JavaScript as the content type here. And so I have this templates thing here, which actually is a Handlebars template, which helps render out the precompiled Handlebars templates that are shared on the client. And it's kind of scary. and here's that right here. So this is basically just some boilerplate to create a YUI module out of this, and then it's looping over each of the templates in the templates array. This data is passed to this template here, and it's just going through and dumping out the name. So it's namespacing it off of photosnearme.templates dot whatever the name is, and then calling Handlebars template and passing in the template data. And so this will return a function that's now usable. So yeah, it's just doing that. And then on the client, so for instance, the views which the client uses, which are y.view subclasses. There's two of them here. It's creating just a local variable here pointing to Photos Near Me templates, and then it's just accessing those templates, which again, these are functions. So it's just assigning them to properties on the prototype of these views. So the grid and the grid photo template. So then when these views are rendered out here on the client, it's using template, which is the grid template, and saying, oh, there's one partial that you can use, which is the grid photo template, which is the function is here. So that allows that's what I had to do. So that was sort of the more complicated stuff, is how to bring these templates from the file system up into a usable state on the server. And I did that by registering them all as partials. And then now I need to get these templates over to the client. So I did that by creating a dynamic JavaScript resource on the server, which is serving a YUI module. And that module, if we go back and look in the config here, here's that module. And so its full path is /templates. So it can't be combo handled with the other modules, but that's fine. And by specifying a full path, it won't be combined. And then the Photos Near Me app module just requires it. So that will load it in. And I guess if I go back here and turn JavaScript back on. So let's see. Just wanted to look in the network inspector. So if we look, it may be somewhat hard to see, but we're loading the YUI seed. Oh, and here's the templates JavaScript. So that's being loaded up for us, and it's that YUI module. And then we have a few combo requests here. These are loading in all the modules that the app needs from the YUI CDN, and then one combo request which loads in the this app's custom YUI modules. And so we're loading those all in here. And yeah.
And that's the app. What struck me as particularly awesome were that when you were looking at each of the individual pieces, they were all pretty small.
Yeah, it is. It is
like so
very
you're
simple. Yeah.
But we get a lot of code reuse, a lot more than what you might expect. As long as you're avoiding working directly against the DOM, there's a lot of opportunity to reuse stuff on the server. So it is about that time, and so we're going to close up shop. We've got a meeting coming in right now, and so I guess if you have anything last to say?
No, I guess the one thing is that my plan is to write up a lot more documentation about how this is actually built, and more of a tutorial on how people can use these techniques and describe the techniques that were used here in more detail, and comment all the code that's up there. But
cool.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for the walkthrough, man. This is really awesome. Okay, so let's see. Next week, Eric, you're going to be out in New York or something like that, right?
Yeah, I am.
So we'll figure out something to do in his absence. And so I guess for today, that's Eric and Luke and Ryan and now everybody else in the YUI team, and a surprise visit from Evan signing off. And we will talk to you guys next week.